Representatives of the excavata include Giardia intestinalis. This protist is found in freshwater sources, rivers, streams, and lakes. This is the reason that you don't drink the water, particularly for hikers. For example, as you're hiking along, you're looking at these pristine mountain streams, you're like, oh, I think I can drink that, we're close enough, and it looks real clean. Don't, because you can't see these, and these are transmitted through feces of contaminated individuals, and so it's also commonly called beaver fever, not beaver fever, but when individual organisms that are host to the parasite go to the restroom or they poop in fresh water, it doesn't matter how far away it is, that water becomes contaminated with Giardia, and you drink it, and you develop essentially diarrhea that can lead to dehydration and even death. So that's Giardia, which is an excavate. Now, that particular disease is called giardiasis, and it's also more commonly known as waterborne diarrhea. How do you get rid of or prevent this particular disease? You either treat the water with iodine or you boil it. So, and you can buy, anytime you go into Cabela's or any of the outdoor stores, you can see some of these water treatment kits and filters that are going to help make sure that you don't end up with this particular guy cruising around in your intestines. Our next representative is Trichomonas vaginalis. This individual, I bet you can't guess where it lives, is going to live in the human reproductive tract. It is a sexually transmitted infection that occurs in both male and female human individuals. Typically, males have few, if any, noticeable symptoms. Females will be more affected by this particular in this particular organism. It causes what's known as trichomoniasis, and so can lead to itching and some change in discharge, but generally it can go for quite a period of time without being diagnosed. And so this is something that's treated very easily in your doctor's office, but definitely one to be aware of, and it's actually quite common. So next we have the Euglena, and Euglena is actually a genus, but we'll just generally talk about them as the Euglena. These are probably the most prominent members of the excavata. These are freshwater organisms that live in lakes and ponds. They are going to be green in color because they contain chloroplasts with the pigment molecule chlorophyll. Now this is important because that's going to allow them to be photosynthetic. And so here we have an organism that can use photosynthesis whenever it's clear and sunny outside, but when things aren't so great, like today, and there's inclement weather or the sun's not out and it's cloudy for a while, they will also consume or absorb other organisms, and so they get a special designation for their metabolism. They are mixotrophic, meaning that they can switch between one strategy and the other. They're also going to have a stigma, and this is going to allow the organisms to respond to changes in light intensity. And so based on where light is oriented, it kind of works like an eyelid that covers a photosensitive light spot. And so wherever light is, they can control the intensity of that light hitting their eye spot, kind of like you would kind of squint your eyes if things were really bright. But it allows them to either move towards that light or away from that light, which allows them to maximize their photosynthetic capacity. Now, here we see images of the Euglena. This is a prepared slide similar to one we might see in lab. Notice that the Euglena kind of have this stretched out oval shape, and you can't see the flagella, but you do see the point at which the flagella would be attached. Here we have a colored micrograph showing a Euglena with its chloroplasts inside and a clear picture of that flagellum. Our next representative of the excavata is the Trypanosoma species. Now, all trypanosomes are going to be parasitic, and there's two types that we're going to focus on. So these live in the that live in the fluid around red blood cells, and so here you can see them in blue. The pink are the red blood cells, and so they're going to swim around that fluid, stealing nutrients that would be normally destined for your cells. This particular trypanosome causes African sleeping sickness. And so African sleeping sickness is characterized by lethargy and fatigue, or a lack of activity, that results from sustained infection by trypanosomes. The vector that spreads this particular disease is the tsetse fly. And so these are found mainly in Africa and other equatorial regions, and we see that what has been called African sleeping sickness is now more commonly being referred to as sleeping sickness because it occurs in more places than just Africa. And so anywhere that the tsetse fly is, it can spread this particular parasite. Now remember or understand, a vector is something that passes the parasite but does not become infected. In fact, the parasite needs the vector because it's going to complete part of its life cycle here in the gut. So this fly is taking a blood meal, and let's say this is an infected individual. As he sucks up blood from this individual, he's going to get some of those parasites, and they're going to start to reproduce asexually through binary fission in the gut of this fly. And then whenever this fly takes a meal from another individual, he will then project those into... Okay, and so as the parasite takes the meal from an uninfected human, so after he's taking up the parasite and it's reproduced in its gut, when he takes a bite of a new individual that's not infected, those mature individuals that have been reproducing like crazy in his gut are now going to move through the salivary glands and down through this feeding tube, the proboscis, into the new person's body, into their blood, and will begin reproducing there, infecting them. And so the vector does not have any ill effects from from taking in that parasite. Instead, they're just passing it from individual to individual. And so here we look at the life cycle of sleeping sickness. And so trypanosomes are introduced into the human host. They're going to start to divide, multiply in the bloodstream. They mature, and now a new fly comes, takes a blood meal from an infected individual. Now that fly is going to be the vector. It's dividing here, and it will continue to do so. And as this fly now takes a bite of another individual, it just goes on and on and on and on. Again, when we look at the different types of sores associated, we'll see that these are indicative of certain types of infections. So this is the type of canker that forms after a bite from a tsetse fly or after a meal is taken from a human host. And so this canker is just, that does not look healthy at all. Other common features associated with African sleeping sickness are the presence of these nodules, particularly along where the lymph nodes are in the body. And so think about your lymph nodes up in your neck, what the doctor feels whenever you get sick. Well, these trypanosomes will end up causing blockages in these areas, and so you get these accumulations of fluid. Eventually, so much of your nutrients are being diverted to support the parasites in your blood, and so these people go into a sleep-like trance or almost a coma, and they're just lethargic. They have no energy to move or do anything. And eventually, they die from being so tired. They just go to sleep and die. So, again, this is something that's treated with antiparasitics, and we see a lot of World Health Organization type movements working to get rid of these types of infections. Our next trypanosome that we'll talk about is Trypanosoma cruzi. This is one that we find more commonly in this part of the world, and actually it extends from South America. And let me see if I have my note. I'm going to put my map up here in a second. Oh, there it goes. And so here you see the map. This one actually has made it up into Texas, and last year we had a scare of Trypanosoma cruzi associated with our dogs. And so this particular parasite causes Chagas disease. Chagas disease is noticeable due to infection and inflammation of the face, particularly of the cheeks and the eyelids. This particular trypanosome is spread by the cone-nosed bloodsucker. That's its vector. And so this organism will fly into your room at night, and it takes a blood meal on your face, and after it finishes eating, it's also called the kissing bug because it gives you a kiss as it takes its blood meal. But after it finishes eating, it defecates or poops right next to where it just finished feeding. And so what happens in humans is anytime you have a break in your skin, you get a histamine response. And so that's going to cause you to kind of itch, or it just signifies something's wrong there. You feel that kind of change in pressure that stimulates you to kind of touch that area. When you touch that area, you also end up scratching some of that feces into that open spot where the animal just finished feeding. As you do that, there are cysts in that feces that are going to be knocked into that opening, and now you've just become infected with this particular trypanosome. And so that's when we see more commonly that you might encounter in this part of the world. Our next supergroup is supergroup Amoebozoa. This group moves only by pseudopodia. They're found in freshwater, saltwater, and moist soils. They eat through a strategy called phagocytosis. Phago to eat, cyto cell, or cell eating. And so they consume other organisms by engulfing them in a food vacuole. Most amoebas are free living. And so like the one we looked at earlier, getting ready to eat that bacterium, that was a free-living amoebozoan. Now there are some parasitic species, and we'll talk about one of them right now. This is the brain-eating amoeba. This particular amoeba lives in warm, stagnant waters and enters the brain through the olfactory nerve, so through your nose. Makes your way from your nose along that nerve up into your brain. Well, your brain is essentially a hot, stagnant pond. When it gets to the brain, it is very happy to be there, and it starts to eat by secreting digestive enzymes. Now, between 2001 and 2010, there have only been 32 infections by this particular amoeba. And within the last 50 years, only 3 people have survived, so it's incredibly fatal once you are infected with this particular organism. And the disease is called primary amoebic meningoencephalitis. Recently, there's been a lot of press about these heat-loving, brain-eating amoebas, as they're commonly called. A girl in Kansas survived an infection after being in a Texas lake about 2 years ago. Maybe 2 to 3 years ago, there was a situation with water quality in one of the parishes in Louisiana, and people were using neti pots, which a neti pot is the small pot that you actually use to run water through your sinus cavity to clear out sinus congestion whenever you're feeling yucky. And so these people would fill up their neti pot with tap water, which they assumed was safe. They've been using water out of the tap their whole life, and they would run that water up into their nose and through the sinuses, and then it comes out the other side of the nostril. The problem is that the water plant that was treating the water before it was delivered to the tap had an issue where it stopped treating the water like it was supposed to, and 3 people ended up getting this type of amoebic infection as they delivered the amoeba directly to the place it wanted to go. And so this is why if you're going to use something like a neti pot, or particularly with babies, I've seen this a lot, if you're going to use something to clear those sinuses out, make sure you're using distilled water so that you can avoid anything like this. If you like to watch the show Monsters Inside Me on Animal Planet, you can Google for the heat-loving brain-eating amoeba and learn more about how it evades the the immune system and essentially kills your brain by eating it. And it's actually a pretty interesting little organism. So, all right, next we have the Rhizaria. So supergroup Rhizaria are going to be found in marine and freshwater environments. These organisms are planktonic, meaning that they're free-floating passive organisms that just kind of cruise around on the surface of the water. They possess pseudopodia, but they're not true pseudopodia. Instead, they're called axopodia. And these structures are used for feeding, and so in this particular picture, you can see them really nicely. They are those projections of the cytoplasm out of the cell, but instead of being used to kind of crawl along like the blob, they're just stuck out so that stuff can stick to them, food particles that are then filtered into the cell so that they can be eaten. Now, when we look at the rhizarians, our first